Sounds like it's time to change your brake pads. But be careful if you drive a classic car, or just an old car, because those old brake pads may contain asbestos. Let's hit the gas on this episode of Asbestos Artifacts. Welcome to Asbestos Artifacts, where we take a look at some old asbestos products and dig a little bit into the story behind them. I'm asbestos attorney Justinian C. Who invented the car? Well, the answer to that is not without controversy. Ask any patent attorney. The popular history behind most inventions usually leaves out a long list of uncredited contributors, especially in the case of complex machines like an automobile, and that's especially clear with braking systems, including today's asbestos artifact, Raybestos-Manhattan asbestos brake linings. Now, I'm lucky enough that my grandfather was a mechanic and he taught me a little bit about fixing cars. In fact, the very first job he taught me how to do on a car was a brake job. If you're not familiar with how brakes work, let's talk about what brake linings are and why they were made of asbestos. That's going to start with a little road trip through Germany. Actually, in some ways, it started a few hundred years before that. A small steam power vehicle was built by an astronomer named Ferdinand Verbiest as early as 1672, and Nicolas Joseph Cugnot made a working steam-powered military carriage in 1769. Steam carriages like Canadian clockmaker Henry Seth Taylor's steam buggy appeared in the 1800s, and inventors from Scotland to the US devised and built electric vehicles of various kinds. Any discussion of automotive history mentions Gottlieb Wilhelm Daimler, who helped pioneer the internal combustion engine and the motorcycle known as the Daimler Reitwagen. But when we think of modern gas-driven cars, most history books name the inventor as Karl Benz, a German engineer whose Benz patent Motorwagen was the first practical petrol-driven automobile put into production. And yet even that contains controversy. For decades, German and Austrian history school books cited the inventor of a gas-driven four-wheeled vehicle as Siegfried Marcus, an Austrian engineer and inventor with dozens of patents, including the T-handled plunger igniter seen in pretty much every Western and Wile E. Coyote cartoon involving red sticks of dynamite. But Marcus also built 4 different models of gas vehicles in the mid-1860s, and there was actually a memorial plaque at the entrance to Austria's prominent technical university and a statue of him in a town square of Vienna. In fairness, Siegfried Marcus's gas vehicles worked only as prototypes, but accounts of him driving down the street exist, and his absence from the traditional story of German automotive engineering was not an accident. Put simply, Siegfried Marcus was Jewish, and when the Nazis came to power, they specifically had all traces of him removed from the official record. Historians have produced copies of the government order requiring that German schoolbooks remove Marcus and cite only Benz and Daimler as the inventors of the automobile. In fact, Marcus's second vehicle even featured a 4-cycle engine, a carburetor, and a magneto-ignition, and until the Nazis required them to edit their corporate materials, the electrical components company Bosch cited Siegfried Marcus as having invented its popular magneto-ignition. As we said at the beginning, many, perhaps most inventions are the product of various inventors, and Karl Benz built and obtained the first patent for what is generally considered the first automobile, a 3-wheeled vehicle powered by a single-cylinder, 4-stroke gasoline engine. Benz's Motorwagen was self-propelled and had a carburetor, electrical ignition system, and a differential gear, which was a critical design piece that let the wheels rotate at different speeds as the car turned. After Benz's Motorwagen, Gottlieb Daimler used one of his engines to build an early 4-wheel gas vehicle called the Konstant Daimler. And another automotive innovator that gets credit along the way is Karl Benz's wife, Bertha Benz, who played many significant roles in Karl Benz's Motorwagen, including one that led to this asbestos artifact. Karl faced challenges early on when he founded his metal shop to develop and build a gas-powered automobile. His design partner, August Ritter, was a skilled mechanic but unreliable and borrowed the foundry's machine tools for his personal use, leading to a dispute and impounding of tools by local authorities. Karl wanted to buy out Ritter, but he didn't have the money. But Bertha had a dowry, a sum of money she received upon her marriage to Karl. Believing in Karl's idea, Bertha used her dowry to help finance his Motorwagen. But Bertha's contributions didn't end there. When Benz patented his Motorwagen in 1885, the public showed little interest. It was Bertha who got the idea of taking a road trip to promote it. Bertha felt that people needed a demonstration of what the Motorwagen was capable of. She also wanted to visit her mother, who lived in Pforzheim. Whether you call it 66 miles or 106 kilometers, Pforzheim was a long distance away then. Bertha's idea was hatched. Now back to that road trip through Germany. In August of 1888, Bertha Benz left Mannheim with her 2 sons in the family motor wagon, the only working one in existence. It was a challenging road with poorly maintained roads and no gas stations. But Bertha was a resourceful and determined person who faced the whole thing with a spirit of adventure. Necessity is the mother of invention, and along the way Bertha fixed components on the motor wagon that broke, at one point using her hat pin to clear the fuel line, which had become clogged. In many ways, Bertha was conducting the first test of the motor wagon as a consumer, and her road trip provided information and feedback needed to improve the design, and that's where today's asbestos artifact comes in. To understand Bertha's contribution, let's have a quick science lesson on friction. When 2 surfaces are in contact, friction is the force that resists motion between them. Friction happens because if you zoomed in to a molecular level, even smooth-looking surfaces aren't really even. Increasing friction can create heat and wear away things like engine parts, but it can also help us from slipping, or help us stop. Brakes of all kinds, bicycles, trains, cars, they all involve using the friction from placing a surface against a spinning wheel to slow it down until it stops. The brakes in Carl Benz's motor car used a lever that pushed wooden blocks against the steel rim of the vehicle's rear wheels. Similar wooden block brakes were already used on horse-drawn carriages and even steam-driven automobiles, which existed at the time, but were discontinued when rubber tires came onto the scene in the 1890s. But Bertha realized that the wooden blocks didn't have enough friction and came up with an enterprising solution, with her garter. For those of you who've never seen Betty Boop, a garter is a band of cloth tied around stockings to keep them from slipping down. Before elastic, stockings and socks would slide down without a garter. Bertha Benz wrapped the garter around the wooden brake block. The extra layer increased the surface area of contact, adding friction between the wheel and brake. It allowed more precise applications of friction, giving Bertha greater control over her speed and braking, and made sudden emergency braking more effective. In doing so, Bertha helped advance friction linings for vehicle brakes, what are often called brake pads or brake shoes depending on the type of brakes your automobile has. Brake pads and shoes help braking systems by adding friction. They also absorb heat and pressure, reducing wear and tear on the brakes, but because of that friction, linings must be regularly replaced. The first commercial brake pads were patented in 1901 by Herbert Froude in Derbyshire, England. They were made mostly of resin, cotton, and camel hair. But as cars got faster, people needed better brakes. Daimler also contributed advances in braking, creating an early model of the drum brake in 1899, as did Mercedes designer Wilhelm Maybach in 1901, and Louis Renault is credited with a drum brake that became the standard for many years. In 1902, American automobile pioneer Ransom E. Olds improved on the design with a pedal. Now, the same year, the first drum brakes were manufactured in Bridgeport, Connecticut by the A.H. Raymond Company, which was later renamed the Royal Equipment Co. The 4-man shop built brakes, clutch facings, and brake linings, and in 1904 they developed a significant improvement on Bertha Benz's garter belt. As we've discussed, friction produces a lot of heat which breaks down the friction material. But asbestos is a fireproof rock that forms as fibers which can be woven and mixed with other materials. So A.H. Raymond invented a woven brake lining made of copper wire and asbestos fiber. Their ability to sustain friction was seen as a significant improvement on braking systems, as they allowed the driver to brake slowly or suddenly with far more control, and the company claimed their Raybestos brakes were in that way double-acting. Raybestos brake linings would stay popular, and as disc brakes were invented, asbestos would continue to be used in brake linings of all kinds into the 80s and even the 90s. A lot of cars were even built with insulation and other components made of asbestos, but brake linings were almost universally made with asbestos. There was a problem with all of this, but it took many decades to surface. Back then, the asbestos industry hadn't revealed everything it knew about how unhealthy asbestos was, that it caused respiratory diseases, including cancer. In fact, the industry in many ways never admitted it publicly, and as their corporate documents came out in lawsuits, many were forced to declare bankruptcy right as millions of exposed workers began to realize they had major health problems from unprotected asbestos exposure. Now, most mechanics change a lot of brakes over the course of their lifetime. My grandfather certainly did, and that's unfortunate in the case of this asbestos artifact, because asbestos breaks down into tiny fibers, microscopic fibers that you can't see. 1 billion of them will fit in a single square inch. Even worse, there's no safe level of asbestos exposure, at least according to the National Cancer Institute, and once you inhale asbestos fibers, they embed in your lungs and bodily tissue and never leave. Asbestos health problems can take 20 to 50 years to appear, so multiple studies have found that mechanics are at risk of asbestos exposure from regularly changing asbestos brake linings like this Raybestos brake pad, sometimes years after they retire. As the truth came out about asbestos, manufacturing brake linings with asbestos was banned, along with many other uses of asbestos. Now, the Raybestos brand still exists, owned by the Affinia Global Brake and Chassis Company. Fortunately, they no longer contain asbestos. But as with asbestos building materials like shingles, tiles, drywall, adhesives, and cement, a lot of it is still out there, and anybody dealing with old cars should be aware of that. In fact, even today, asbestos brake linings are still out there on old cars and even in some warehouses and mechanic shops. That's why OSHA guidelines still recommend that when changing brake linings, mechanics should assume they contain asbestos and use precaution and preventative measures like masks accordingly. With respect to the adventurous and innovative Bertha Benz, let's just be glad her garter wasn't also made of asbestos. That just doesn't sound very comfortable. See you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm asbestos attorney Justinian Lane. Thanks for watching.